It all began with a faint sense that something was off, a tiny disturbance in the rhythm of our everyday lives that I couldn't quite place at first. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination running wild, convincing myself that I was overthinking things, that the small changes in his behavior, the subtle evasions, the little half-truths, were just ordinary lapses in attention or the stresses of daily life. But as days passed, the sense of unease grew, an insistent whisper at the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. There were phone calls he would take in private, messages that seemed to disappear when I glanced at the screen, and an unfamiliar tension in the way he moved around the house. It was not the kind of tension that comes from ordinary worry or fatigue. It was different, calculated, deliberate, as if there was a story being written that I was not allowed to read. I started noticing patterns, small details that made my intuition flare. He would always leave the house at odd hours without explanation, sometimes even suggesting vague errands or meetings that didn't quite add up. The sense of secrecy was palpable, and every evasive answer fueled the suspicion that had begun to gnaw at me. I became more vigilant, paying attention not just to what he said but to what he didn't say, the spaces between his words, the glances that lingered too long at a phone screen before being quickly hidden. I began to retrace his steps mentally, trying to reconstruct the timeline of his actions, comparing stories and statements, looking for discrepancies that could confirm or deny the nagging feeling I could not shake. Each small inconsistency was like a spark, igniting the growing realization that something beyond ordinary stress or distraction was at play. My mind started working in overdrive, imagining scenarios, testing them against what I knew to be true, seeing which fit and which could be dismissed. I observed how he interacted with friends, colleagues, and even strangers, noting subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his tone changed, the slight hesitation before he spoke. I was gathering pieces of a puzzle I did not yet fully understand, and each piece was confirming my fear. The anxiety was almost physical, a tightness in my chest, a constant alertness, but it was paired with a strange sense of determination. I realized that before acting I needed clarity, a clear understanding of what I was dealing with. Acting on raw emotion alone could backfire, and I wanted a response that was precise, measured, and undeniably effective. I started documenting things quietly, noting times, places, behaviors, and any snippets of information that seemed out of place. The process itself was methodical, almost like detective work, and it gave me a sense of control in a situation that initially felt overwhelming. I began to anticipate his movements, noticing the patterns in his absences, the frequency of private calls, the timing of certain messages, and the way his behavior shifted when certain topics were mentioned. I didn't want to confront blindly, I wanted evidence, a complete picture that would allow me to make my move with confidence. Every revelation, every tiny confirmation of my suspicions, fueled a sense of quiet satisfaction mixed with a burning desire to reclaim agency over a situation that had been quietly undermining me. The planning stage was as much about understanding him as it was about understanding my own limits and capabilities. I asked myself questions I hadn't dared to before. How far would I go? How clever could I be? How could I assert my presence without creating unnecessary chaos? These questions guided me toward a strategy that required patience, observation, and timing rather than impulsive action. I visualized different scenarios, running simulations in my mind, considering his possible reactions and the ripple effects on those around him. I considered the emotional impact, the moral weight, and the practical execution, balancing each element carefully. I realized that in order to act effectively, I needed to detach partially from the immediate sting of betrayal and approach it as a challenge that required intelligence, strategy, and a sense of control. The planning became almost an art form, a careful choreography of movements, observations, and anticipated outcomes, each step meticulously thought out before being enacted. I knew that I wanted my response to be subtle yet unmistakable, an act that spoke volumes without a single word needing to be exchanged. It was not just about exposing the betrayal, it was about reclaiming my dignity, asserting my presence, and demonstrating that cleverness and composure could triumph over deceit and secrecy. The more I observed, the more confident I became in my approach. I felt my anxiety transform into a quiet determination, a readiness to turn the situation on its head in a way that would be unforgettable. And I began to lay the groundwork for the next steps with a meticulousness that reflected both my intelligence and my desire for justice once I had confirmed my suspicions and understood the extent of his betrayal. I realized that the way forward was not through anger or confrontation. I knew that reacting impulsively would only hand him a momentary victory, giving him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel, and I refused to grant him that power. Choosing strategy over confrontation became not just a choice, but a necessity, a conscious decision to channel my emotions into something controlled, deliberate, and effective. I reflected on past experiences, the times I had allowed frustration or indignation to dictate my actions, and how often those moments had left me exhausted, regretting words spoken or actions taken in haste. This time would be different. I would let my mind guide my response, letting careful planning dictate the course rather than letting the raw sting of betrayal dictate my behavior. I considered all possible avenues, imagining each reaction and weighing the outcomes meticulously. Every potential scenario had its consequences, and my goal was to assert my presence and reclaim my agency without creating unnecessary drama that could spiral beyond my control. I reminded myself that true power often lies in restraint, in the ability to act decisively while appearing calm, unshaken, and even indifferent. I studied him quietly, observing his moods, his tendencies, and his blind spots, noting the moments when he was overconfident, distracted, or complacent. These were the windows through which a clever strategy could be executed, moments where subtle action would yield the maximum effect without alerting him to my awareness. I considered the psychology of betrayal, understanding that people often underestimate those they seek to deceive, assuming that secrecy ensures control. That assumption became the foundation of my approach. I would act in plain sight, exploiting the very confidence that he believed shielded his actions. I made mental notes about timing, location, and execution, building a plan that relied on precision, patience, and the element of surprise. I visualized each step, running multiple simulations in my mind, asking myself how he might react, what signs of guilt or discomfort would appear, and how I could maximize the impact of my presence without saying a word. Every detail mattered: the logistics of travel, the scheduling of my own movements, and even the subtle gestures that would convey awareness without confrontation. I knew that strategy required discipline, the discipline to hold back immediate reactions, to let the plan unfold exactly as intended, and to trust the process I had carefully designed. I reminded myself that strategy is not about revenge in its rawest, most explosive form, but about turning circumstances into a stage where truth reveals itself naturally, leaving those responsible to confront reality in a way that words alone could never achieve. I analyzed the emotional dynamics, recognizing that people who cheat often operate under the illusion of invisibility, believing that their actions remain undetected. Exploiting that illusion became central to my plan, knowing that subtle observation and silent presence could communicate far more than confrontation ever could. I prepared for patience, understanding that a plan executed too early could lose its potency, while too much delay risked missing the perfect alignment of events that would make my actions most effective. Every choice was intentional, from the timing of my own departure to the careful avoidance of drawing unnecessary attention, all contributing to the careful construction of a situation in which the truth would reveal itself dramatically without a single forced confrontation. I also reflected on my own emotions, ensuring that my drive for strategy did not waver under the weight of hurt or frustration. I allowed myself to feel, to acknowledge the betrayal and the sting of deceit, but I refused to let those feelings dictate my actions. Instead, they became fuel, a quiet fire that sharpened my focus and clarified my objectives. I considered the reactions of others, the possible ripple effects, and the potential to reclaim not only my own dignity, but also a subtle moral high ground that comes from acting intelligently rather than impulsively. Each layer of planning reinforced my confidence, reminding me that strategy is as much about mental fortitude as it is about tactical execution. I began to see the power in silence, in observation, and in acting with precision. Every small action, every decision, became part of a larger choreography designed to assert control, reclaim agency, and subtly expose the truth without a direct confrontation, leaving him unaware of the full extent of my awareness while positioning myself to turn the situation to my advantage. Once I had my strategy firmly in place, the next step required careful planning and flawless execution, securing the exact same resort room he had chosen for his secret getaway. It was not as simple as making a reservation. It required timing, precision, and an understanding of logistics that could turn a seemingly ordinary act into a statement of quiet empowerment. I began by researching the resort meticulously, reviewing available rooms, layouts, and proximity to key areas, understanding that the power of my plan rested on occupying the space closest to theirs without drawing attention. I imagined the scenario in detail, visualizing the subtle impact of my presence, the irony of proximity, and the psychological weight it could carry without a single word exchanged. Every decision had to be precise. The dates had to align perfectly, the timing of check-in had to coincide without overlap that would arouse suspicion, and the manner in which I booked the room had to be discreet to avoid detection. I called the resort, posing questions casually, gathering information about availability, amenities, and the layout of adjoining rooms, all under the guise of an ordinary vacation inquiry. It was almost like detective work, combining strategy with creativity, each conversation a way to confirm details and eliminate uncertainty. I knew that logistics mattered as much as intention. A poorly timed reservation or a room too far away would diminish the subtle impact of my presence. I considered alternative options, contingency plans, and backup dates, understanding that flexibility would allow me to adapt if unforeseen circumstances arose. I meticulously mapped routes from the main entrance to the room, imagining the brief encounters that might occur in hallways, lounges, or pool areas, and how those moments could reinforce the quiet observation that was central to my approach. I thought about the timing of arrivals and departures, planning to avoid detection while still ensuring that my presence was noticed, if only subconsciously, through subtle cues and the shared space around us. Booking the room required not just practical knowledge, but also a sense of psychological timing, understanding that the smallest detail could shift the balance of the situation. I prepared my own schedule to ensure that my stay mirrored theirs, tracking the dates they had chosen, anticipating possible changes, and remaining flexible enough to adapt while maintaining the integrity of my plan. Every phone call, every confirmation email, every small detail of the booking process was executed with a sense of purpose, combining precision with patience. I visualized the moment of arrival, the quiet satisfaction of occupying the room next door, and the way the situation could unfold naturally, allowing me to observe without alerting them to the fact that I was aware of everything. I considered the emotional resonance of this act, the subtle power it carried, and how it could shift the dynamics without confrontation. I knew that logistics were intertwined with psychology. The positioning, timing, and visibility were all part of the strategy that would turn a simple room booking into a statement of intelligence, control, and awareness. I researched every amenity, every common area, and every potential point of interaction, anticipating moments where my presence could reinforce my plan without overt action. I thought about arrival times at the pool, restaurant, or spa, imagining small, almost imperceptible coincidences that would highlight my proximity while remaining casual and natural. I also considered the human element, understanding that people rarely suspect the meticulousness behind a quiet, strategic presence, and that the impact of being there would grow exponentially through their own assumptions and complacency. The process of booking the room became a game of precision, observation, and subtlety, each decision layered with intentionality and each step reinforcing the careful choreography I had designed. I checked confirmations, double-checked dates, and even visualized alternate scenarios to ensure that nothing could go awry. The act of securing the room was more than logistical. It was an exercise in patience, planning, and strategic thinking, a way to assert agency and presence without aggression or confrontation. I recognized the quiet satisfaction in knowing that the plan was unfolding exactly as intended, that every element, from timing to location, was aligned to create a situation where observation, subtlety, and psychological impact converged into a single, precise, and empowering moment. Once I had secured the room next door and ensured that everything was aligned perfectly, the next phase required patience, subtlety, and a keen eye, observing their actions without them realizing that I was watching. It was not about spying in the traditional sense, nor was it about catching them in the act in a way that would create immediate confrontation. It was about understanding, noticing, and allowing the situation to reveal itself naturally while maintaining complete control over my own presence and emotions. I began by studying patterns, the way they moved, the times they chose to leave the room or spend time in public areas, and the subtle interactions that would give away their routines without them suspecting that their privacy had been breached. I realized early on that observation was as much an art as a skill. It required blending into the surroundings, becoming almost invisible while simultaneously being hyper-aware of every gesture, expression, and conversation. I noticed the way he would glance around when making a call, the small hesitations before he spoke, and the subtle signals of tension whenever certain topics arose. These small cues became pieces of a puzzle, each one contributing to a larger picture that I was piecing together in real time. I observed them in communal areas, the pool, the lounge, the dining room, watching the casual interactions, the fleeting expressions, and the micro-behaviors that reveal so much more than words ever could. It was remarkable how often people underestimate the power of silent observation, assuming that their private actions are invisible, that no one is noticing the little signs of deceit, indulgence, or guilt that slip through even the most carefully constructed facade. I maintained a calm, almost indifferent exterior, walking past casually, sitting at a discreet distance, blending with other guests while my mind cataloged every interaction, every slip, and every moment that confirmed what I already knew. I noticed the subtle ways they tried to mask their behavior, the tiny adjustments in posture, the little attempts to control glances, and the strategic avoidance of certain spaces or times that might make them visible to others. Each observation reinforced my understanding of their intentions and provided insight into their character, showing patterns of carelessness, overconfidence, or denial that I could use to anticipate their next moves. I also paid attention to the surrounding environment, the layout of the resort, the location of entrances, hallways, and common areas, because these elements influenced how and when I could position myself to observe without being noticed. Timing was critical. Arriving at certain areas too early or too late could risk detection or diminish the subtle impact I was aiming for. I became attuned to the rhythm of their days, the small habits that repeated consistently, and the moments when their guard was naturally lowered, creating opportunities for me to notice details that others might overlook. There was a strange satisfaction in watching them unknowingly reveal themselves, in noticing the contradictions between their words and actions, and in understanding the depth of their disregard for the truth while remaining completely composed myself. I documented mentally every interaction, every glance, every laugh, every whisper, not for confrontation, but for the clarity it gave me in understanding the full picture of the situation. The act of observing became almost meditative, a combination of patience, analysis, and strategic thinking that allowed me to feel in control even in the presence of betrayal. I considered how each small action could ripple outward, how a simple glance or gesture could communicate volumes without a single word, and how my silent awareness could exert influence without being overt. The power of observation lies not just in witnessing, but in interpreting, understanding, and preparing for the precise moment when the knowledge gained can be used to achieve the intended effect. I balanced vigilance with subtlety, always aware that detection would undermine the careful structure of my plan, and I learned to anticipate their reactions, to understand what they assumed about others' awareness, and to use that assumption to my advantage. Every day, every interaction and every subtle revelation added to a growing understanding, reinforcing my ability to respond intelligently, calmly, and strategically, while simultaneously ensuring that they remained oblivious to the fact that their actions were being carefully and quietly watched. After days of careful observation and understanding the patterns of their actions, the moment came to assert my presence, not loudly, not through confrontation, but subtly, undeniably, in a way that could not be ignored. This phase was about transforming all the quiet patience, planning, and vigilance into an invisible influence, a presence that spoke volumes without a single word, a reminder that I was aware, capable, and in control. I began by positioning myself in spaces they frequented, timing my own movements to coincide naturally with theirs, creating a sense of shared environment while maintaining the guise of ordinary vacation activity. Every gesture, every casual glance, every unintentional crossing of paths was calibrated to communicate awareness without accusation, a psychological statement that presence alone could make without drama. I recognized early that turning the tables required confidence, the kind that does not demand recognition but radiates through subtle cues, posture, demeanor, and timing. The power of a quiet, calculated presence lies in its ability to unsettle the unaware without overt action. I walked past them casually in corridors, smiled politely when our paths intersected in communal areas, and maintained an air of unshakable calm that contrasted sharply with the tension they were trying to hide from each other. Every small interaction became a tool for influence, a way to assert control over the environment without confrontation. I learned to read microreactions, the fleeting glance, the stiffened posture, the brief hesitation, as confirmation that my presence was being felt, even if they would never consciously acknowledge it. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that without raising my voice or exposing them publicly, the situation was shifting subtly, power moving in my favor, the equilibrium tilting toward awareness, dignity, and clever assertion. I became deliberate in shared spaces like the pool, the lounge, or the restaurant, timing my presence so that it felt natural yet significant, an unspoken reminder that their secrecy had limits. I noticed the small, almost imperceptible changes in their behavior, the careful avoidance of eye contact, the slight stiffening when paths crossed, the nervous laughter that betrayed unease, and understood that subtlety could be far more impactful than confrontation. It was a dance of presence, observation, and timing, where each step was carefully measured and each interaction reinforced my quiet authority in the situation. I also used indirect observation as reinforcement. Seeing their reactions to my presence confirmed the psychological impact without the need for overt action. I realized that sometimes the most effective statement is one that is implied rather than declared, understood rather than spoken, felt rather than confronted. The environment became my ally. The proximity of the rooms, the overlapping schedules, the shared spaces, all of it orchestrated to allow my presence to communicate awareness, control, and quiet dominance without the risk of direct conflict. I focused on maintaining composure, knowing that any hint of frustration, anger, or eagerness could undermine the subtlety and reduce the impact of my strategic positioning. The goal was to make my presence undeniable in its effect while appearing ordinary and unremarkable on the surface, a paradox that required both observation and intelligence. I noticed how their complacency and assumptions worked against them, how they underestimated the significance of a silent, aware observer, and how that underestimation amplified the effect of every subtle signal I sent. Every interaction, every shared glance in passing, every brief moment of proximity became a reinforcement of the dynamic I was creating, a reminder that awareness and strategy could prevail over deceit and secrecy. I also considered the moral and emotional weight of my actions, ensuring that my subtle assertion was rooted in dignity rather than vengeance, in intelligence rather than impulsivity, and in empowerment rather than vindictiveness. It was a lesson in the power of presence, the art of subtlety, and the effectiveness of strategy over confrontation. I became attuned to the emotional currents, noticing shifts in tension, unease, and awareness, and adjusting my actions to maintain the delicate balance that kept my influence both undeniable and understated. Each calculated step, each deliberate positioning, each casual interaction contributed to a growing realization on their part that secrecy was no longer a shield, that clever presence could communicate what words could not, and that subtlety could turn the tables in ways that confrontation never could as the entire experience unfolded. I began to recognize that the most profound impact of this story was not just in the cleverness of the plan or the precision of its execution, but in the lessons. It offered about empowerment, wit, and self-respect. It became clear to me that true power does not come from confrontation, drama, or revenge in its rawest form, but from the ability to observe, understand, and respond in a manner that maintains one's dignity while asserting presence and control. I realized that empowerment is rooted in the awareness of one's own worth, the understanding that no betrayal, deceit, or attempt at manipulation can diminish the strength of someone who acts intentionally, thoughtfully, and strategically. Throughout the experience, every step I took reinforced a sense of autonomy, showing me that I could reclaim agency over situations that at first seemed entirely beyond my control. Wit became an essential tool, a way to navigate complexity without succumbing to anger or impulsive reaction. I learned that cleverness, timing, and subtlety could achieve results that blunt confrontation could never match. There is a unique satisfaction in witnessing the natural consequences of actions, in observing a situation unfold in a way that exposes truth while preserving one's composure, and in realizing that intelligence and foresight can be far more impactful than loud displays of emotion. The experience also highlighted the importance of patience, showing me that waiting, observing, and understanding the full picture before acting amplifies the effectiveness of any response. It is in the calm calculation, in the strategic choices made quietly behind the scenes, that one discovers the true essence of empowerment. I reflected on the psychological dynamics at play, the assumptions people make about the invisibility of their actions, the complacency born of secrecy, and the underestimation of those they seek to deceive, and understood how these elements can be leveraged without malice, but with clarity and purpose. Self-respect became intertwined with every decision, reinforcing the principle that how one responds to betrayal speaks volumes about character. By choosing observation, strategy, and subtle assertion over impulsive reaction, I maintained my integrity while asserting authority over the situation, demonstrating that strength is not always loud or visible, but is often quiet, deliberate, and undeniable. The experience offered lessons in emotional resilience, showing me that hurt, disappointment, and frustration can be transformed into fuel for thoughtful action rather than destructive behavior. I learned to harness emotions, channeling them into strategic thinking and purposeful presence, which reinforced both confidence and composure. I recognized that the satisfaction derived from clever action and observation far outweighs the fleeting gratification of anger-fueled retaliation, because it is rooted in intelligence, dignity, and foresight. I also discovered the value of subtle influence, the idea that presence, timing, and wit can shift dynamics in ways that are both effective and sustainable, leaving a lasting impression without the need for confrontation or aggression. These lessons extended beyond the immediate situation, shaping my understanding of relationships, trust, and personal boundaries, and providing a framework for navigating future challenges with clarity and confidence. I reflected on how empowerment is cultivated through choice, how wit is strengthened through observation and analysis, and how self-respect is preserved through intentional action rather than impulsive reaction. Each layer of the experience reinforced the importance of maintaining composure, leveraging intelligence, and asserting agency in ways that are both subtle and undeniable. I realized that the greatest victory is not in exposing betrayal for its own sake, but in reclaiming one's own sense of power, confidence, and dignity, turning a challenging situation into a demonstration of resilience, strategy, and quiet authority. By observing carefully, planning meticulously, and acting with precision, I understood that the lessons extend far beyond the immediate scenario, offering insight into human behavior, the dynamics of trust, and the ways in which one can assert presence and intelligence in any situation. Empowerment, wit, and self-respect became the pillars of the experience, guiding every choice and every action, showing me that cleverness combined with patience and dignity can transform even betrayal into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and undeniable assertion.